Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Wright on Crime podcast. Wright on Crime is a national campaign of the Texas Public Policy Foundation that supports conservative solutions for reducing crime, restoring victims, reforming offenders, and lowering taxpayer costs. My name is Britt Allen, and I am so excited for the guest that we have today, all the way from the beautiful state of Kentucky, our very own National Director, Rachel Wright. Hi, Rachel.
Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to Austin. How's it going?
It's going well. Happy to be in Austin.
We're so glad that you're here. We know that you're extremely busy. It's a busy time of year, but we appreciate you coming and chatting with us on the Wright on Crime podcast.
Absolutely.
I feel like we have a lot that we need to get to. You are such a wealth of knowledge, so I can't wait to hear all about your story. So to kick us off, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you and what do you do at Wright on Crime?
Absolutely. So I am the National Policy Director for Wright on Crime, a job that I absolutely love because I get to be part of the conversation on national criminal justice policies. And that includes efforts in Congress, the White House, and executive agencies to improve our criminal justice system, taking victims into account, looking for opportunities for fairness, better use of the taxpayer dollar, and promoting public safety. So it's a job that I love. It's an issue area that I think is core to our nation, and I love the position.
I'm so glad that you do. You have brought so much to our team. You haven't even been here a year yet, but like all of the work that you do is so impactful. So give me a little bit of background about your career. Like, how did you get started in criminal justice? How did you get to Wright on Crime? Like, give me a little bit of color in your story.
Right. So I am both a career prosecutor and a policy wonk. So I started out after law school doing trial work in Kentucky, in Kenton County, Kentucky. And I did mainly drug cases. So looking for a lot of drug prosecutions, possession, but also got to work on a lot of trial work, including your bigger felonies like attempted murder, and even sexual violence cases. After that, I moved to Washington, D.C., where I was fortunate to work for Senator Chuck Grassley on the Senate Judiciary Committee for about 5 years, getting to focus on everything within the crime portfolio, ranging from criminal justice issues to illicit drug policy and even FISA reform within the national security space.
Wow.
A really unique and fabulous opportunity working for a truly true gentleman of a senator. And then I went back to career prosecutor work. I did 2 years with the Kentucky Attorney General, appellate criminal litigation primarily, and got to do oral arguments before the appellate courts in Kentucky on keeping offenders incarcerated who deserve to be incarcerated, doing those post-conviction and collateral appellate issues. And then I had always known about Wright on Crime, particularly after my work in Washington, D.C., and when the opportunity presented itself to do more policy work, I was delighted to be considered and kind of lean into that space again.
That's so cool. Gosh, you must have been so busy in your career. I'm like, did you have time for hobbies? Like, how did you do all of that?
Well, I do love the Great British Baking Show. And so during COVID, we all experimented with dough.
Absolutely. Well said. The other thing I think is really amazing about you is that you're a mom of 2 boys. And having a career like yours and then also being a mom, that's a lot to juggle. But tell me a little bit about how being a mom of those 2 sweet boys impacts your passion for criminal justice and your outlook on everything.
Oh, for sure. So I'm obviously the first parent to ever feel this way, that whenever you have children, your entire perspective changes. What you thought were your priorities, they kind of are still, but it just shifts. And so I was so blessed to have 2 beautiful, healthy young boys. And my perspective on how I can be a good mom for them has also shifted. And so whenever I'm thinking about how can I give my children the best childhood, a safe future, that's something we all want. But I'm fortunate to be in a position where I can kind of actually institute that change as opposed to just wishing for it. And so whenever I'm thinking about these criminal justice policies, it's not just this random theoretical amalgamation of thoughts. It's actually what evidence-based, concrete things can actually make my child's future better, make them feel safe and empowered, and make them feel like they can walk down the street at night, make them feel like they can also be stewards for fairness and redemption and holding violent offenders accountable. So it has just shifted it where I'm thinking about policies in terms of well, this is why I believe in my heart of hearts it's going to make our community safer, but also this is what's going to make it better for my boys. And so that's just the framework that I think adds a lot more perspective to how I do my job.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I would say for just about everybody that works at Right on Crime and TPPF, we're a strong believer in the mama bear. And y'all's protective instincts translate so much over to the policy world because the mama bears get stuff done. So it's very cool to hear how that's impacted your career and how you look at all of this. I want to go back a little bit to your experience in Chuck Grassley's office. You were a pretty instrumental part of this implementation of this little thing called the First Step Act, which we know is not little at all. I would love to hear more about that story. Tell me about what that was like, your hand in it. Give us the details.
Right. So whenever I started out with Senator Grass's office, I was focused only on drug policy. So I was watching the First Step Act becoming law. And I just remember thinking, I want to do this. I want to do this. How do I become that staffer that gets to be in charge of this for this office? And fortunately, as things kind of happen in Washington, one person shifts to one job and you fill in the shoes of another person. So whenever I got to do First Step Act implementation, I was thrilled. And what that looked like for that office and kind of the Republican dais on Judiciary Committee and the Republican side of the Senate was looking for those opportunities to hold DOJ and the Bureau of Prisons to account on what the law says they should be doing. Because a lot of the First Step Act requires BOP to lean in and provide evidence-based recidivism reduction programming. And it requires DOJ to comply with a lot of the law, which is allowing for opportunities for retroactive sentencing for crack offenders. So implementation was very nitty-gritty, in the weeds, wonky kind of conversations, but I found it to be extremely important because the First Step Act was this landmark bipartisan criminal justice bill that impacts so many people. But if there was not a robust, effective implementation, the conversations on criminal justice improvements could wither on the vine. A lot of individuals who were interested in the First Step Act and supported it have since thought, well, I did my job. I voted in favor of this, but I don't want to do any more criminal justice related activities because folks in the conservative side sometimes don't see this as a conservative issue, but it is. And so a lot of my implementation efforts were also to show this law works and here's how it helps public safety. So for those folks who are not, believers in improving the criminal justice system or have a little bit of hesitancy about how to best do that, they can say, oh, the First Step Act increased violent offenders on the streets. I disagree with that, and I think data disagrees with that, but also I point them to recidivism numbers. We know about 45,000 folks were released by some way or another by the First Step Act, and the rate at which that person is going to reoffend, the data so far we know from DOJ, is under 10%. So in the abstract, 10% is kind of hard to understand what that means. Comparing it to non-First Step Act individuals, it's around 45% for federal offenders. So we know if you care about public safety, if you care about helping victims, and you care about holding bad guys accountable for what they did, let's do more policies like the First Step Act. So the implementation is critical because it helps kind of grease the wheels for further considerations of those improvements because we know it can work. So let's build upon it.
Oh, I love that so much. Tell me a little bit. I feel like there's several misconceptions about the First Step Act. I know you said a lot of people don't feel like it's a conservative piece of legislation, but it is. So if there was something that maybe you'd want anybody to walk away from this episode with that would have a better understanding about the First Step Act, what would you want to tell them?
Oh, that's such a good question. So I think one of the things that Senator Grassley was really passionate about, that I am too, is the sentencing reform component of the First Step Act. So there's the prison reform parts, which Senator Cornyn was a huge advocate and proponent of, and it's very important. There's also the sentencing reform component. And particularly within the First Step Act, there's a few different ones, but I'll touch on one that I think is really common sense and makes a lot of sense to think about. So crack and powder cocaine offenders under federal law are sentenced differently for a number of reasons. And this is not the podcast to go into the weeds on that. But ultimately, what the First Step Act did is it provided opportunities for retroactive sentencing of an adjustment on the sentencing disparity for your crack cocaine offenders. And this is a conservative idea, not not specifically the retroactivity, but the impact that this provision had. Because individuals often think whenever you're providing retroactive relief, it's a get out of jail free card. That means you're immediately going to the streets. No, it is an eligibility component where you're having discussion on public safety, but then also it provides still a lengthy sentence for those bad actors. So those crack offenders who are eligible for retroactive sentencing, I think their sentences on average went from like a 26-year sentence to still a 17-year sentence. So it's not like they were retroactively eligible for a lower sentence, got it, and then left prison. The First Step Act was still saying these violent offenders or these offenders who are endangering our communities by spreading drugs, let's keep them incarcerated for the amount of time that makes sense for their offense. So it's still on average 17 and a half years. But we're still in a conservative mindset of thinking, is this a good use of the taxpayer dollar? Is this a good way that we are helping people reform and rehabilitate and seek redemption within the carceral system if they're going to be languishing for an extra 10 years? So I think that kind of prism of looking through this issue is definitely a way that conservatives can be considering criminal justice.
Oh, I love that. And you explain it so clearly. That makes so much sense. I want to pivot a little bit because obviously you're our national director. So you're plugged in to criminal justice issues on a federal level. So I want to ask you, it's a very open-ended question, but I just have to know, what issues are you seeing right now? But then also, like, what are the solutions?
Right. So it's an interesting time in Congress for criminal justice issues, because we did this massive bipartisan First Step Act in 2018. And for the average person, we're like, well, 2018, that was pre-pandemic. That was 6 years ago almost. But in congressional terms, that was recent memory. And so you have to kind of recalibrate the fatigue for certain members to want to engage on a large package like the First Step Act, and think of what are the fringe issues that can garner bipartisan support and are that aren't throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's still victim-centered, public safety-centered. And so some things that I'm really excited about and find opportunities for interest on the federal level include clearance rate legislation, include improving our supervised release system, include looking for opportunities to address overcriminalization, which is a very evergreen conversation on a bipartisan basis. And also looking for opportunities to improve oversight and accountability. I'm a Chuck Grassley alumni, and he loves oversight and accountability more than anything. And the Bureau of Prisons, for instance, is rife with issues. And it's really sad because we think about the BOP being the place where your federal offenders should be able to, well, one, be punished to the extent that they should be, because certain bad guys, they should be. But also, we believe that the Bureau of Prisons is also the place where people can receive that second chance, find opportunities to rehabilitate themselves, and seek grace and redemption. And so the BOP, unfortunately, though, has a lot of issues, ranging from inmate violence, sexual violence, infrastructure, staffing shortages, access to healthcare, aging inmate populations. So opportunities to see more into the system, to make it more accountable and transparent, is really important, and things that Congress is willing to look into.
Right. So when it comes to what's going on in these prisons, you know, and we're talking about accountability and oversight, you know, for someone who maybe would look at that issue and say, well, these people committed crimes, they're in prison, we don't really care what happens in prison. Why should we care what happens to people inside of these prisons?
That is such a good question, because I think a lot of people really do think that way.
Sure.
And I would say, well, it's twofold. If you look at it from a basic human aspect, you know, we love all of our neighbors as if they were ourselves. Like we have to love other people because it's just the human way. But if that doesn't click, I totally get that. I respect it, because a lot of people are in prison because they did something wrong to another person or to their communities. So we have to think through, why do we care about this? And it's because 95% of those folks who are incarcerated are going to be reentering society in one way or another. And your future neighbor, your future colleague may have been one of those ex-offenders. So how do we basically make sure that your future neighbor is not committing a crime in your neighborhood? So we have to care about making these individuals most equipped to succeed. And so that increased accountability and visibility into the prison system on the federal level encourages that. If we understand where those issues of violence are happening, why staffing matters, where the staffing shortages are, we then have a better idea of how those dollars can be used, the taxpayer dollar, to help rehabilitate, to help staff. And then we also have a return on our investment. These folks who are presented the opportunities because we know where the issues are, they can actually do something about it. And then we have probably better outcomes for public safety.
I love that so much. You present it so clearly, and you're absolutely right. Ultimately, like, this is a public safety issue. It doesn't feel like it is because it's insular inside of a prison, but it is. It affects us all on the outside at some point. So thank you so much for explaining that. I feel like I could sit and talk to you about these forever, and I know one day we will. But I want to ask you as well, what makes you feel optimistic that the country is headed in the right direction in terms of a more effective criminal justice system? Because I know in states and on a federal level, sometimes it doesn't always feel that way, but we at Wright on Crime know a little bit better. So could you tell us why you feel optimistic?
Right. And it's hard to feel optimistic sometimes. We're in a very interesting season right now with presidential politic rhetoric, etc. Everyone's tough on crime, but I'm very optimistic because Congress is still able to function on a bipartisan basis on some of those kind of ancillary issues I was talking about. So for instance, recently President Biden signed into law the Federal Prison Oversight Act, which does empower more accountability and transparency into the prison system. There's also bipartisan interest on things like making our federal criminal code more effective, reining in unelected administrative agencies from imposing criminal sanctions. There's also opportunities for either administration and either body of Congress, regardless of who's in control, to have conversations on criminal justice reform and criminal justice improvements. So we know that President Trump was the individual who signed into law the First Step Act, and we know that Vice President Harris has some record one way or the other on how she feels about criminal justice issues. So I believe in either administration, you're going to have a groundswell of folks reinvigorating this conversation. And in terms of the Senate and the House, there are always leaders in there who are pushing for improvements. There are always individuals who are looking for ways to make it more common sense, make it more fair, hold bad actors accountable, put the victims first. There's always issues and ideas percolating. So I still remain optimistic despite this season of rhetoric.
No, I love that so much. I know over the next years to come, you and our executive director, Britt Tolman, have y'all's hands full, but if anybody can handle the work, it's you guys. Y'all are so good at what you do. And I appreciate you coming and having a conversation with us about all of this. If someone wants to keep up with you and all the work you're doing on a federal level, where can they find you?
Right. So I'm on X, not Twitter. I almost said Twitter, and now I did. At Rachel Wright ROC. So Wright on Crime, Rachel Wright ROC.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rachel. We can't wait to have you back. So many more conversations to come. And thank you guys for joining us on the Wright on Crime podcast. To reach out to our team or learn more about these issues, visit our website at wrightoncrime.com. We'll see you next time.